Smile right now. Go on, actually do it, and look at your cheeks in whatever reflection you can find. A phone screen, a window, a mirror on the wall. If 2 small dents appear near the corners of your mouth, you have something that around 1 in 5 people on Earth also have. And for your entire life, somebody has probably explained it to you the exact same way. 1 gene, dominant. You either got it, or you didn't. End of story. Here's the problem. That explanation is almost completely wrong, and the real story hiding underneath it is stranger, messier, and honestly a lot more interesting than a single gene ever could be. We're going to start with where this myth even came from, because it didn't just appear out of nowhere. For most of the last century, biology classrooms needed simple examples to teach the basics of inheritance. Teachers wanted a trait. Students could check on their own bodies, something visible, something that seemed to follow a clean pattern from parent to child. Dimples fit that need perfectly. They're easy to see, easy to talk about, and easy to turn into a 2-line rule on a chalkboard. So generation after generation of students got taught the same shorthand. Dimples come from a single dominant gene, meaning if even one of your parents has the gene, you're likely to have dimples. 2. It got repeated in textbooks and trivia nights, in casual conversations at family dinners for decades. The problem is that biology textbooks written for beginners often simplify complicated traits down to a single gene story because it's easier to teach, not because it's actually true. Dimples became one of the most famous examples of that shortcut. For a long time, that simplified version was basically unquestioned. Parents would look at their kids and try to trace the dimples back through the family tree like a game of genetic bingo. Grandma had them, so did an uncle, so obviously the gene just skipped a generation and popped back up. It felt tidy. It felt like something you could draw out on paper with a few letters and arrows, capital D for dominant, lowercase d for recessive, and predict exactly who in a family would end up with dimples and who wouldn't. That kind of story is satisfying because it makes genetics feel orderly, almost like a math problem with one clean answer. But here's where the tension starts to show up. If dimples really were controlled by one simple dominant gene, the pattern should be incredibly predictable. 2 parents without dimples should essentially never produce a child with dimples, aside from rare new mutations. And 2 parents who both have dimples should have a very high chance of passing them on every single time. In reality, families don't behave that cleanly. Plenty of people with 2 dimple-free parents grow up with visible dimples of their own. Plenty of people with 2 dimpled parents end up with completely smooth cheeks. Identical twins, who share essentially the same genetic blueprint, sometimes have different dimple patterns from one another. One twin with a dimple on the left cheek only, the other with none at all. If a single dominant gene were really running the show, none of that should be possible, with any regularity. Something didn't add up, and that gap between the tidy textbook story and the messy real world is exactly where the real science starts to get interesting. So let's actually open the hood and look at what a dimple is, mechanically. Because once you see the real mechanism, the messy inheritance pattern suddenly makes a lot more sense. A dimple isn't a separate structure sitting under your skin like a hidden button. It's actually a visible sign of how one particular facial muscle is built and attached. That muscle is called the zygomaticus major, and its job is to pull the corners of your mouth up and outward whenever you smile. Think of it like a string running from a bone near your ear down to the skin near the corner of your mouth. Every time that string tightens, your smile gets pulled wider. In most people, that muscle is a single, more or less uniform band, and when it contracts, it pulls the skin smoothly without creating any dent. But in people with dimples, that muscle isn't one clean, single band. Somewhere along its length, it splits into 2 smaller bands, or it develops an unusual little branch, and that split point often attaches directly to the underside of the skin, instead of just passing beneath it. When you smile, the muscle pulls, but because of that odd attachment point, it tugs the skin inward at that exact spot, instead of letting it move smoothly outward. That inward tug is the dimple. It's not a hole and it's not a gap in your skin. It's a tiny anchor point created by a slightly unusual muscle shape, pulling the skin down toward the deeper tissue every time you smile. Think of it like a tent. If every rope pulling on a tent pulls the fabric evenly outward, you get a smooth, even shape. But if one particular rope is looped and tied differently, doubled back, split, attached at a different angle, that one spot gets pulled in a different direction than the rest of the fabric, creating a small crease exactly where that odd rope attaches. Your zygomaticus major muscle is one of the ropes, your cheek skin is the fabric, and a dimple is the crease that shows up when one small part of that rope is built just a little differently than the rest. There's another everyday comparison that makes this even clearer. Think about a bed sheet pulled tight over a mattress. If the sheet is tucked in evenly all the way around, it stays smooth no matter how much you tug on it. But if one corner is tucked under at a slightly different angle than the rest, pulling on the sheet creates a small crease right at that one spot, even though the rest of the sheet stays perfectly flat. Your facial skin works the same way. The zygomaticus major muscle is the hand pulling the sheet, your cheek skin is the sheet itself. And the odd attachment point where the muscle splits is that one corner tucked in differently. Every time you smile, you're tugging on the sheet, and the crease shows up in exactly the same place every single time, because the odd tuck point doesn't move. That's why a dimple always appears in the same spot on the same person's face. Smile after smile, year after year, even while the intensity of it can shift a little as facial tissue changes. Now here's the part that matters for the whole predictability question. Building a muscle that splits in one particular spot instead of running as a single clean band is not a light switch. It's not one gene flipping between an on state and an off state. It's closer to a complicated construction process during early development, involving multiple genes that guide how facial muscles form, how they attach to skin, and how much variation is allowed in that process from one person to the next. Scientists studying facial muscle variation generally treat traits like this as what's called polygenic, meaning many small genetic differences work together to influence the outcome, rather than one single gene deciding it completely. It's less like a light switch and more like a recipe with a dozen ingredients, where slightly different amounts of each ingredient change how the final dish turns out, instead of one single ingredient determining everything by itself. That's a very different picture than the one-gene chalkboard version, and it explains why the pattern in real families looks so much messier than the simple story ever suggested. It also explains a few other odd things about dimples that never fit the old story very well. For one, dimples are often asymmetrical. Plenty of people have a dimple on only one cheek, not both, which makes much more sense if the muscle split is a developmental quirk that can happen independently on each side of the face, rather than a single genetic switch that should, in theory, affect both sides equally. It also explains why dimples can become less visible with age. As people get older and facial fat distribution changes, that same muscle attachment point can pull less noticeably on the skin, so a childhood dimple can fade or nearly disappear by adulthood, not because the gene turned off, but because the surrounding tissue changed shape around the same underlying muscle structure. This is exactly where the popular myth falls apart the hardest, and it's worth sitting with why that matters. The dominant gene story isn't just a slightly oversimplified version of the truth. It actively predicts things that don't happen. It predicts that two dimple-free parents essentially can't have a dimpled child without an extremely rare new mutation, and that two dimpled parents should pass the trait. On the overwhelming majority of the time, real families break both of those predictions regularly. The polygenic developmental story doesn't have that problem because it never promised a clean, predictable pattern in the first place. Multiple genes, contributing small effects to a developmental process, naturally produces exactly the kind of inconsistent, skips-a-generation, one-side-only pattern that dimples actually show in real life. The myth felt satisfying because it was simple. The real science is less quotable on a chalkboard, but it actually matches what you can observe by looking around at real families. It's worth pausing on why the simple gene myth spread so successfully in the first place, because it says something about how we tend to talk about genetics in general. Single gene traits are rare and precious from a teaching standpoint because they're so easy to explain and so satisfying to draw as a diagram. Something like earlobe attachment or the ability to roll your tongue got taught the same simplified way for decades. And in several of those cases, later research showed the real picture was more complicated than the classic textbook version too. Dimples just happen to be one of the more famous examples, partly because they're so visible and so commonly discussed, and partly because the mismatch between the myth and real family patterns is so easy for anyone to notice just by looking at their own relatives. Now let's pull the lens back much further, because a facial muscle that occasionally splits into two bands instead of running as one clean strip isn't unique to humans, and it isn't new. Facial muscles across mammals show all kinds of small structural variations, from one individual to the next, extra slips of muscle, unusual branch points, slightly different attachment locations. This kind of variability is common in muscle development generally, not just in the muscles that happen to control human smiles. Our early ancestors, going back tens of thousands of years and further, would have carried the same basic zygomaticus muscle, doing the same basic job, pulling the corners of the mouth during any kind of expressive movement, whether that was an early version of a smile, a bared teeth display, or simply the muscular groundwork for chewing and moving food during eating. Small variations in how that muscle attaches would have existed the whole time, quietly present. In some individuals and not others, long before anyone was around to notice or care whether it created a visible dent in the cheek. That's actually a really important point about a lot of visible human traits. The underlying variation, the raw material for the trait, often existed long before it became something people paid attention to or gave a name to. Dimples didn't appear at some specific dramatic moment in human history. The developmental flexibility that allows a muscle to occasionally split into two bands has likely been quietly present in primates and their ancestors for an enormous stretch of time, showing up here and there as a byproduct of how facial muscles form long before any human culture attached meaning to it. This is where it's worth stepping back and thinking about how facial muscles do their job across mammals in general. Muscles that control facial expression are unusually variable compared to a lot of other muscles in the body, like the ones that move your arms or legs. Limb muscles tend to be under a lot of tight developmental control because getting the mechanics of walking or grasping wrong has serious consequences. Facial expression muscles have more room to wander a little, developmentally speaking, because a slightly unusual attachment point in a cheek muscle doesn't really threaten survival the way a badly formed knee muscle would. That looser control is part of why traits like dimples and other small facial quirks show up with so much individual variation from person to person and even side to side on the same face. Evolution simply hasn't had strong pressure to iron out these particular differences, because they don't meaningfully affect whether someone can chew, speak, or survive. It's worth thinking, too, about how this connects to our closest living relatives. Other primates rely heavily on facial muscles to communicate, baring teeth as a warning, pulling lips back in a submissive display, or using subtle mouth movements to signal calm during grooming and social bonding. The zygomaticus muscle, or something very close to it, plays a role in a lot of that expressive movement across the primate family tree, not just in humans. That means the basic biological hardware capable of producing a dimple-like quirk has likely been sitting in the primate lineage for a very long time, quietly. Available as one possible outcome of normal developmental variation, long before humans existed to smile at each other the way we do now. A trait doesn't need to be useful or meaningful to persist. It just needs to not get in the way, and a slightly split facial muscle clearly doesn't get in the way of anything important, which is likely part of why this kind of variation has had so much room to simply exist, generation after generation, without evolution bothering to smooth it out one way or the other. That deep time backdrop also helps make sense of why dimples show up in so many different human populations around the world, rather than being tied to one specific ancestry or region. Because the underlying variability in facial muscle development is ancient and widespread across humanity, dimples appear in populations across every continent in roughly similar overall proportions, rather than being a marker unique to one group. If dimples were the product of one recent, geographically isolated genetic event, you'd expect to see them concentrated heavily in one part of the world and rare almost everywhere else. Instead, they show up fairly broadly, which lines up much better with the idea of an old, widely shared developmental quirk in a muscle that every human, everywhere, happens to have. Let's bring this back down from deep time to something a little more human and immediate. Because traits like this always end up mattering to actual people's lives in ways that go beyond biology class. Dimples have carried real social weight across a huge range of cultures and historical periods. In many places and eras, dimples got tied to ideas about beauty, luck, charm, or even fertility. Some cultures developed folk beliefs that dimples marked someone as especially fortunate, or as someone touched by some kind of blessing at birth. Other traditions treated a dimple as a small physical proof that a person was naturally warm or trustworthy, something you could supposedly read off their face before you ever got to know them. None of that reflects biological reality, but it shows how a simple visible trait, tied to a quirky little muscle attachment, can pick up enormous cultural meaning that has absolutely nothing to do with the actual mechanism underneath it. There's also a more grounded, practical side to why visible facial traits like this matter to real people, beyond folklore. Facial recognition, in both the everyday human sense and in more formal contexts, like historical identification records, forensic work, or even early photography and portraiture, has long used small distinguishing marks, freckles, moles, scars, and yes, dimples, as identifying features. A dimple is exactly the kind of small, stable, visible marker that shows up consistently across someone's life and can help distinguish one face from another in a crowd, in a photograph, or in a written description. That's a much smaller stakes story than something like disease resistance, but it's a real concrete way that a tiny developmental quirk in a facial muscle ends up mattering in ordinary human life, well outside the realm of genetics. You can actually trace this cultural fascination through art history too. Painters across many different eras and regions, working long before anyone understood genetics at all, went out of their way to capture dimples in portraits, sometimes softening or even adding one that wasn't quite as pronounced in real life, because a dimple read to the eye as warmth, youth, and approachability. Sculptors working in stone faced an even harder technical challenge, since carving a convincing dimple into marble takes real skill. And the fact that so many historical sculptors bothered to attempt it at all tells you how much visual and emotional weight a small facial crease was assumed to carry, long before anyone could explain where it came from. None of that history changes the biology, but it's a good reminder that humans have been captivated by this one small muscle quirk for a very long time, for reasons that have nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with how a human face reads to another human face. And speaking of stakes, it's worth being honest about what dimples are not connected to, because the myths don't stop at the single gene story. Over the years, dimples have been tied in popular imagination to all kinds of claims that have no real scientific backing. You may have heard that dimples mean someone is naturally more cheerful, more flirtatious, more trustworthy, or even luckier in life. None of that holds up. A dimple is a structural quirk in one facial muscle. It has no established connection to personality, temperament, intelligence, or any broader trait about who a person is. The same goes for claims tying dimples to specific ancestries or ethnic groups in any meaningful, exclusive way. Because the trait shows up broadly across human populations worldwide, and because it's driven by variation in a developmental process rather than one clean genetic marker, dimples can't reliably tell you anything about somebody's ancestry, heritage, or genetic background either. It's simply too common, too variable, and too weakly determined by any one genetic pathway to work as any kind of reliable label for identity. Now here's the twist, the part that breaks even the more accurate polygenic picture in an interesting way. And it's worth saving for the back half because it complicates things just enough to keep the story honest. Dimples aren't only something you're born with as a fixed feature. There's a category of dimples that shows up later, sometimes well into adulthood, connected to significant, often rapid changes in body weight or facial fat distribution. When someone loses a noticeable amount of facial fat, whether through weight loss, illness, or aging, the same underlying muscle attachment quirk that was always there, quietly hidden by a fuller cheek, can suddenly become visible for the first time. The muscle didn't change. The genetic instructions that shaped it during development didn't change either. What changed was the layer of tissue sitting on top of it, and once that layer thinned out, the pre-existing structural quirk in the muscle became visible as a dimple that seemingly appeared out of nowhere. This means two people can carry the exact same underlying muscle variation and never know it, because one of them happens to have enough facial fat covering that spot to smooth it over completely, while in the other person, thinner facial tissue lets that same structural quirk show through clearly as a visible dimple. It also means a dimple can seem to appear or disappear across a person's life without any change at all to their underlying genetics, purely because of changes in the tissue layered on top of that muscle. That's a genuinely strange exception because it shows that the visible trait, the thing you can actually see and photograph and point to, isn't a perfectly direct readout of the genetics underneath it. There's an entire extra layer, the amount and distribution of facial fat, sitting between the genetic and developmental instructions and the final visible result on someone's cheek. Two people can have identical instructions and completely different outcomes simply because of something happening in a completely separate biological system. So where does that leave us, honestly? Dimples are real, they're common, and they come from something you can actually explain in a sentence once you understand the mechanism. A small, fairly ordinary variation in how one facial muscle, the zygomaticus major, attaches to the skin during development, likely shaped by multiple genes working together rather than any single dominant switch, and sometimes only made visible later depending on how much facial tissue sits above that particular spot. That is a genuinely interesting, well-supported explanation. What it is not, and what it has never been, is a reliable predictor of personality, of ancestry, of intelligence, or of anything resembling destiny. It doesn't tell you whether someone is kind or lucky or trustworthy. It doesn't tell you where their ancestors came from with any precision. It's a small structural quirk in a facial muscle. Nothing more, and honestly, nothing less either, because the actual mechanism turns out to be a lot more interesting than the tidy myth it replaced. If this is the kind of hidden story your own body has been quietly carrying around this whole time, without you ever getting the real explanation, there's a lot more of it out there. The gap between your ear and your jawline, the shape of your earlobes, the way your fingers curl, all of it has its own version of the same kind of story, a simple myth on top of a much stranger, much more human mechanism underneath. So go back to that mirror one more time. Smile the way you did at the start of this video. Whatever you see on your cheeks right now isn't a coin flip that got decided the moment you were conceived. It's the visible result of a tiny quirk in one small muscle, shaped by a handful of genes working together rather than one dramatic switch, sitting quietly under your skin your entire life, occasionally hidden, occasionally revealed, depending on nothing more mysterious than how your face happens to be built. If you want more of these deep dives into the biology hiding in plain,